Good morning, everybody. I think that we are going live here. So we're actually coming to you legitimately live from the Capitol today here in Helena. I am hiding away in the gallery in the House chambers. This is one of the quietest places I was able to find in the Capitol right now. Of course, the House floor doesn't convene until 1 p.m., but there are still plenty of legislators at their desks answering emails, working on things. So there's still a lot of hustle and bustle, even though they're not actually in session right now. So I'm going to wait and pause just a moment here and see if we can get some more people to jump on, give people an opportunity to get on the feed. So I'm going to actually flip the camera around and give you guys kind of the bird's eye view of our House chambers for just a couple seconds, because it's really one of my most favorite rooms in the Capitol. It's really beautiful, and so if you've never had the opportunity to see it in person, I highly recommend you do. So bear with me. Hope this isn't too wobbly. So yeah, there's a few legislators working on the floor already today. Plenty of stuff going on. And yeah, it's just a big, beautiful room. You probably can't see it very well, but there's really beautiful mural painted at the front of the room, and same with the Senate chambers as well. There's really a lot of detail to these rooms that Facebook Live won't do justice to. So hopefully you can see it in person. Okay, I'll flip you back around here. All right, there we go. So again, I also need to apologize because in my hustle to get out of the house this morning and get to the Capitol, I left our tripod at the house. So I'm going to do my best to be a steady Eddie for you guys this morning and hold my phone as still as I can and hope that this isn't too uncomfortable for any of our viewers. And there I go right again. So anyway, we'll get started with a couple things, and I want to say too that if there is ever a question, please don't hesitate to jump in. I get to roll in and I forget to stop and ask for questions, so interrupt me. I do listen to the comments and look at it, but I have a few bills that we'll talk about in detail. So the first one we'll start with is House Bill 48 that we heard earlier this week. It was carried by Representative Bob Brown, and Farm Bureau supported House Bill 48. Just pulling up my notes here. Again, sorry about the tripod, everybody. And what House Bill 48 did was amended current statute that would clarify that if an irrigator is changing, for example, from flood to pivot irrigation, that does not trigger the change process through the Montana DNRC. And that's a good thing because the change process through Montana DNRC can be pretty cumbersome. A lot of water users are hesitant to engage in it because oftentimes it means a reduction in productive acres. Hopefully the background noise isn't too loud if you guys can hear all the legislators on the floor down there chatting. But at any rate, so we supported this bill because we think that if you are not changing anything else about the way you irrigate, you're simply changing your method of irrigation, going from flood to pivot irrigating, that you shouldn't be required to go through the change process. Now, if you were going to be changing your point of diversion or changing anything else about how you irrigated, or bringing in a whole bunch of brand new irrigable acres under that pivot, then that's a little bit of a different story. But for a straightforward change in irrigation method from flood to pivot, this cleans up that language and makes it clear that irrigators are not required to go through the change process simply to change that method. So again, that was a great bill. Representative Bob Brown carried. We heard it in the House Natural Resources Committee earlier in the week, and I do know that they have taken executive action on that, but I predict it to come out of the committee pretty easily. So I am sure we'll be hearing it on the House floor here soon. The second bill was also another natural resources bill, also carried again by Representative Bob Brown, and it was House Bill 49 actually, and it was heard the same day. And what this bill did was clarify the process for updating water rights transfers. So we had House Bill 48, which was Representative Bob Brown's bill that we supported, and then consequently we had to turn around and oppose his bill, House Bill 49. This bill dealt with the transfer of water rights, whether you are just selling water rights, or maybe you sold land and the water right is getting transferred with that piece of land, there is a permit process, or excuse me, not a permit process, but there's a paperwork process that has to take place between DNRC, the landowner, and it also loops in the Department of Revenue in that conversation. And oftentimes the DNRC has to wait for a specific form from the Department of Revenue in order to complete the actual transfer of that water right. And that's not always a smooth transition. There can be a bit of a backlog and those things can stack up. But what this bill would have done would have given the water court the authority to terminate a water right if they hadn't gotten all the information that they needed. They would have had the ability to just terminate someone's water right. And we oppose this because we think that that's a very, very aggressive, inappropriate measure to take, especially when it's something that is oftentimes outside of the control of the water right user. And if it's a miscommunication between two branches of government, then that's something that the water user should not be penalized for. So we asked for all references of terminating water rights to be removed from that bill because there is actually a component of language in that bill that is beneficial to us in agriculture. It would allow the water users themselves, in the instance of transferring a water right, to provide the necessary information to DNRC. Oftentimes that means you have to provide the water right information that's being transferred, as well as information about the deed of land being transferred, and you would be able to fill out the form from Department of Revenue and get all of that information in on your own. So we actually think that that's good and would potentially provide some reprieve from a backlog of information if the landowners and water users had the ability to just turn in the information themselves. So initially we oppose this bill, again, like I said, because the termination of the water right is a completely inappropriate, aggressive action to take. But if that bill, and we did ask, if that bill is amended in committee and all references of terminating water rights are removed from that bill, we would support it because we do think that having that other component in there is beneficial to water rights users. So those are the two water bills that I'm going to talk about in depth this morning. So I see we do have a few viewers. I'll just pause for a second while I pull up my notes for the next bill, and if anybody's got any questions, just throw them out there. Hopefully it's not being too wobbly so far. I think I'm doing okay. So we'll move on a little bit and move over to the House Fish and Game Committee. And we testified on House Bill 96, which was carried by Representative Zach Brown. And what House Bill 96 would have done was it revised the laws around providing landowner elk licenses to landowner permits, to landowners. So currently in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, there is a program called the 454 program. And what it is designed to do is to incentivize public access to private lands. And landowners can negotiate a contractual agreement with FWP about how many public hunters they want on their property, what seasons they want them to hunt, bow, rifle, etc. If they want to be the ones that communicate with the hunters, or if they want to utilize a game warden to communicate with and schedule the hunters. So all of the criteria regarding what the landowner wants gets negotiated in that agreement with FWP, and then it's approved by the department, and the landowners then participating in the program. Well, it's a pretty underutilized program, and as much as, to the best of my knowledge, all I could find out was that it has only been utilized by about 2 landowners. So it's a program that isn't widely well known within FWP, and this was an attempt to actually increase the incentive for participation in that program. And this concept was discussed in the interim by the Private Lands Public Wildlife Council, and Representative Zach Brown is bringing this language back as a result of a lot of conversations that were had there. So what this bill does is it changes the parameters around that 454 program, and would allow that for every 4 public hunters that you allow on your property during a hunting season, you would get 1 additional elk tag. So you are a landowner who's entered into that contractual agreement, and in your contract you say, I will allow 16 public hunters through the duration of the season. And FWP says, okay, great. They will then draw 16 names from their pool of permittees that didn't draw another tag. And those 16 names will be the people that have the opportunity to come and hunt with you on your property per all of the criteria that was discussed in your contractual agreement. And as a result, the landowner would then secure 4 additional elk tags. And in the bill, those elk tags are either antlered or antlerless, depending on kind of the area and the region and what the general tags stipulate in that region. And a landowner may designate them to an immediate family member or to a full-time employee. There was some discussion in committee about amending the bill, and the question was raised, why can't a landowner give that extra tag to anybody he wants or she wants? And so there was some discussion about actually amending that in and just simply saying that a landowner could designate that additional tag to anyone they wanted. And that language is fine by us. That's something we would support. And so we did support House Bill 96 as well. You know, I will say that is it a perfect solution? No, because we know in Montana that we have regions of the state with grossly overpopulated elk herds that wreak havoc for a lot of farmers and ranchers in those areas. And so while we think that concentrated, effective management is really the answer, this certainly is another tool in the toolbox if a landowner chose to participate in that program. So we do think it's another tool out there that's available for folks to utilize if they so wish. A few other bills that I'll just kind of run through real briefly that we testified on this week. House Bill 97 by Representative Denley Logie, and that bill moved to raise the block management payment cap for landowners enrolled in the block management program from $12,000 to $15,000. And that bill was heard yesterday, actually. Also heard yesterday in the Senate Agriculture Committee was Senate Bill 73, which was carried by Senator Pat Cannell. And this bill reinstated funding for the Livestock Loss Board and the Predator Mitigation Fund. And this was a pretty straightforward bill because that fund has to be reinstated every few sessions. It always has a termination date on it. And so at this point in time, we were moving to reinstate it until I believe 2023 is the language that was in statute. And so that bill was yesterday. Again, both of those bills are things we support. This afternoon, we will be in the House Natural Resources Committee for a few different bills, House Bill 104 and 107, which are both carried by Representative Carl Glim. And these bills address receiving funding and receiving funding for the groundwater management program and the, I gotta look at my notes so I make sure I tell you the right name, the Surface Water Assessment and Monitoring Program. So again, both of those things that as senior water rights holders we support, because it's really important to have the hydrogeology and the science in all of our basins regarding the availability of surface water and how much groundwater there really is, so we have an accurate picture of how agriculture is going to be affected by further development or changes to those basins. So we'll be watching what happens with those bills this afternoon. And going into next week, we have 3 bills scheduled on Monday, and that's it for now. It's a sort of an unusual session. Again, if anybody's got any questions, please throw them in there. I'll just pause again briefly, but we're off to a rather slow start this session, and as we enter the 3rd week next week, there are very few bills impacting agriculture that are scheduled that we will be testifying on. And in fact, across the board, some of the committees aren't even meeting because the bill quantity just isn't there. And a lot of that has to do with some of the financial restrictions and the budget constraints that Montana is going to be facing this session. And essentially, if the bills have money in them, they're not being heard at this point in time because they're not sure what the budget's going to look like. So there's going to ultimately be a lot of time spent in the Senate Finance and Claims and the House Appropriations committees as we get through that budgeting process and actually develop a more finite idea of what the state's budget is going to look like and what the impacts are going to be across the board for all industries, not just agriculture. So that's really kind of put a damper on the amount of bills that get dropped in the hopper and get scheduled for committee. It's really slowed the process. So I have faith that the legislative process will speed up, because it always does. People have priorities, they have ideas, they have changes they want made, and so I think that we'll see them speed up here in a couple weeks, but for now it is still relatively slow. So hopefully you guys are taking advantage of some of the information that's getting posted in the comments. All of those links, of course, will take you directly to copies of the bills that we have talked about here. And that's all I've got for you this week. I'll sign off there. If anybody does have any questions that you think of later, or as you're maybe watching this replay later on today, please, you can either send me an email, you can call our office at 587-3153 and they can get you forwarded straight to me. You can send us a message on Facebook, you can tweet us, whatever is your preferred method of communication, but we would definitely love to try to answer your questions and be of assistance if we can. So thanks to all of you who tuned in again this week, and we will be back again next week. Thanks, everybody.